and he came back and he said, man, I don't know who these guys are, some brewery from Bloomington, but they had a line at their booth all weekend long, and it never went down. And I said, did you try any of their beer? How's the beer? Is it any good? I never even got in the line, he said, because it just never went away. So I didn't even get in the line and wait for a sample of beer. So needless to say, a few years later, I found myself selling the beer, and I'm really proud to be selling it now as a representative of the brewery, just because I believe in what we do. So a little bit of background on Destihl. We were founded in 2007, as I mentioned, in Bloomington, Illinois, by a gentleman named Matt Potts. Matt Potts was an attorney who got a homebrew kit from his wife for Christmas, and he started homebrewing beer. And that led to his idea to start a brew pub, and that brew pub spun off into a second location in Champaign. And then from there, in 2013, we opened a production facility also in Bloomington. And we've been brewing in that facility, doing all our canning and our kegging of beer for the last few years. And we are in the process of completing a brand new production facility also in Bloomington. So really big operation where we're going to be brewing a whole lot of beer to keep all you people very happy. There are still 2 brew pubs. There's one in Bloomington. There's one in Champaign. The food at the restaurants is like the brewery is basically the restaurants are American gastropubs, so they're basically American food done in classic traditions with also a lot of modern techniques. If you get a chance to go up there, stop off and visit. The food at the pubs is really, really outstanding. I mean, I think there's some of the best restaurants in the area, and that's not just because I work for them, it's because I've eaten there a whole bunch, and I always walk away going, damn, that was really good. We have a question. Yeah, good question. The pubs have their own brewers. In Illinois, and in every state, there's always a bunch of different kinds of liquor laws, and they kind of vary from state to state. In Illinois, you cannot participate in more than one. There's a 3-tier system. Sorry, let me stop and talk about this beer real quick first. This is our Abbey single. Abbey single is kind of an interesting beer. It's modeled on the types of beers that would be consumed by Trappist monks. We're familiar, maybe some of the class is familiar with Trappist beers. They're brewed by monks in monasteries. There used to be 6, and I think there's technically more now that are authenticated Trappist breweries. So we know of a lot of Belgian beers that come out of those breweries. A lot of them are really big, triples, quads, doubles, and we think, the myth that we're sort of is kept alive is that those beers are what the monks drink, like during Lent and when they're fasting and all this kind of stuff. The reality is they're drinking beers more like this. They brew beers, most of them at their monasteries, that are a low ABV Belgian sessionable beer. And that's typically what's served in the monasteries, not the crazy 9% quad. And, we think oftentimes like, man, they don't eat for 40 days and all they do is drink this. Like, how do they survive? Probably wouldn't if that is what all they were drinking. So, again, this is a beer that essentially, it doesn't really have a certified style in the beer judging program. But it's a Belgian table beer, or we call it a Belgian single. Essentially, it's a Belgian golden ale. It's brewed with a Trappist yeast strain, and then we make sure that it really knocks out at a lower ABV. We don't give the beer enough sugar, basically, through our malt bill to turn into a big monster 9%er. So this beer is 4.9%. It smells like a Belgian beer. Has those notes, kind of honey, maybe a little bit of hay in there, like kind of slightly grassy. It's definitely got a sweeter, malty nose to it. And then when you taste this beer, kind of a medium to high level of carbonation. Again, a little bit of sweetness. All those phenolic and estery notes that we get from all the classic Belgian beers, but we get that nice sessionable alcohol level. So you don't get as much burn. You don't get the really, really long finish that you'll get on a triple or a quad. But something that brings those flavors to you, but without so much of the alcohol content. So, yeah, that's kind of the nuts and bolts on Abbey. This is a beer that a lot of people, when you try to describe it to them, often it doesn't come across. It's something you almost have to taste. But it is extremely food-friendly beer. Probably one of the more food-friendly beers that we make. Definitely kind of pairs with everything. So, any questions about Abbey? No, good. Okay. Well, you can save them for the end too. That's all right. Where was I when I was talking before? Three-tier system. So, thank you. Matthew Potts, he is, unfortunately, you cannot own a production brewery and a brew pub. You can't own a production brewery and own a distributor. You can't own a distributor and a brew pub. You kind of see where this is going. Basically, the Illinois state laws try to prevent people from participating at every level of the three-tier system, which is producer, wholesaler, retailer. So he had to divest his interests from the pubs. So the pubs have their own brewers. I believe the original question was, what about the pubs? What do they make that's different than the brewery? The pubs have their own brewers. They have their own brewing equipment. They brew on their own cycles. They brew the same beers on our menu that we do in the bottles and cans, but they kind of get to play around a little bit more. If you guys are familiar with the tap room versus the bottle works, Bottle Works pretty much only ever has what they're bottling at the time to serve, whereas the tap room has all these funky offerings. Yeah, it's kind of similar for us. At the brewery, we're only making what we're bottling and canning and kegging. At the pubs, we get to play around a little bit more. At our new brewery, we will have a 10 barrel pilot system that we can use to do a lot more one-offs and unique things like that. So, yeah, we'll keep those fun, fresh offerings coming. And the nicer thing is that I will have them available to sell to places like Cicero's when they're looking for something that's a little different, not the usual stuff. So the new brewery is going to be opening this spring. It's just a few miles away from the current brewery, and I mean, that's probably like 2, which is also very close to the original pub in Bloomington. It will have its own tasting room. We'll also have the 10-barrel pilot system, so you'll see things on tap there that you won't find at either of the pubs, and you won't see initially in bottles or cans, but if it's really popular, it'll probably get bottled or canned. It's usually how it goes. Yes. We do both. Primarily can. Most of our beers, as you see up here, are sold in cans. The bottles, we only do 500 milliliter bottles at 16.9 ounces, and that's for all of our beers in our St. Dekkerra series, which we'll get into a little bit more because we're going to try a couple of those. And then kind of a lot of our limited series of special release beers. So we have a beer called Deadhead Double Red that we're actually not going to be trying tonight, but that's an example of a beer that we make. It's an Imperial Red IPA, and it's only available for purchase outside of a bar or restaurant as a 500 ml. So it's in this bottle. Yeah. That's a good question, and I asked the owner when I was actually up there a couple weeks ago for training. We were having lunch, and I said, "So Matt, where does the name Destihl come from?" And it has a somewhat interesting story. It's actually sort of a. It's not so much a pun, it's a kind of an altered version of a type of German architectural style. called Destihl. It's 2 words, Destil. There's a J in there somewhere, all right? There's a J in there. That's all I remember. They took the J out because it was already hard enough. And they kind of smushed the 2 words together. And part of why they did that, they liked the architectural style, and they incorporated elements of that into the design of the new brewery. But in addition to that, I'm sorry, the original pub, not so much the new brewery. But what they really liked about it was when they Googled the name, no search results came up. And so more so than just having an issue with copyright or anything else, Matt felt that that was an opportunity to define what distill meant. It had no prior meaning. It wasn't even really a word. So by turning it into a word, we got to determine as a brewery what distill means, what it represents, what it says about the kind of beer we make. So that's, in a nutshell, where that came from. Okay, I've been handed another beer, which means we've all moved on. We forgot about Abbey Single. This is a beer called Clockweiss. It is a Berliner Weiss style beer. So we're basically talking about a wheat-based beer, a low ABV beer that has been, in this case, it's been kettle soured to be a very tart, bright, kind of a acidic, slightly citrusy, refreshing wheat beer. So Berliner Weiss does have a historical precedent. It's from Berlin. Napoleon's soldiers toasted with these beers when they overran, I don't know if it was Saxony or Germany at the time, but anyway, they did, and they loved it, and they toasted it like it was champagne. It's common in Berlin to see these beers served with some syrups. Raspberry and woodruff are common, and they basically take the edge off of the sour tart aspect of this beer and give it a little bit of sweet. I've had a few bars over the years that have made their own syrup. Some of the guys that are a little bit more hands-on artisan mixology bars will often make little syrups and top some of these beers off with those. So again, a wheat-based beer, no other additional ingredients. We can kind of get into the topic of kettle souring versus traditional souring methods if you guys would really like to. Yeah, okay, we want to talk about that? Yeah. Actually, we really don't filter any of our beers. We do use some processes to, at this point in time, we basically, when we're transferring beer to a bright tank, which is its conditioning tank, essentially that's after the yeast has been pitched and the initial fermentation has taken place. What happens there is the beer sits in a big, I'm sure everyone been on a brewery tour? Everyone, yeah, pretty much, okay. You see those big steel tanks that kind of come to like a cone at the bottom? What happens there is basically all that yeast, as it's transferred in that tank, it just sits. The beer just sits. The yeast just slowly settles to the bottom. And then we can siphon the beer off of that tank above the yeast and get a much more clear beer. So we don't really do that. But with the kettle sours, there's probably a lot less knockout or like conditioning. We're not really that worried about conditioning these beers. So to get into a little bit about traditional souring methods versus kettle sour methods, I'm sure if you guys are shopping around, you see a lot more sour beers in the market than you ever have before. A lot of different price points, a lot of different sort of, I don't know how to say it, but there's a lot of different verbiage on labels that kind of talk about their souring process, but if you're not making beer, some of it might seem a little bit hard to crack into. But basically, traditionally, sour beers were made by taking beer and adding it to a barrel, be it a big barrel or maybe like a wine barrel or something like this, and allowing wild yeast. Yeast is a microorganism that just is everywhere around us all the time, and it infiltrates the beer, and it starts to do its little thing, and it basically it will turn the beer sour over time, similar to like making vinegar, or if you let wine sit out for too long, the same process basically happens. So that's been going on for centuries. It's a very traditional method of doing it. We make some beers like that. In fact, the last 2 beers we're going to try today are made using those methods. Gosh, we're already. I'm talking too much. So, okay, I just have 3 beers. Okay, so there's some modern brewing techniques that are getting employed frequently with a lot of the more inexpensive sour beers, and that is in no way a knock because we make beers this way. But the more inexpensive sours that you'll find out there are often kettle soured. And what that basically means is that we brew a beer, and before we're finished with it, we move it back over to a tank. Like we go through the process of brewing a beer pretty much like everybody else does. But we move it into another tank where we heat it back up the temperature varies, but let's just say 80s, and then we pitch the same type of bacteria and yeast culture that would naturally find its way into the beer, only we found one we really liked, and we just kept feeding it sugar to keep it alive. So that yeast now resides in a big tank in our brewery, and we can add it at any point. So we'll use that starter, add it to the beer, warm it back up, and then the process that would normally take years to slowly occur can occur in a matter of a day to 2-3 days. It just kind of depends on how sour we want to get it. Yes, sir, in the back. Yeah, actually, I will, we can talk a little bit about that. The yeast strain that we use in these beers was essentially reclaimed from a barrel. It is wild Illinois yeast. The soil in Illinois and in Missouri and most of the Midwest is super fertile. I could go into a long story about glaciation and how all of the soil became so fertile after the last ice age, but no one cares about that. Essentially, we have good farmland here for a reason. It's full of all kinds of nutrients and bugs that are good, and so basically this yeast strain or this bacteria formed in one of our wood barrels. We really liked it, so we just kept feeding it and kept it alive. So we can use it time and time again. Yes, sir. Saison Rousseau was a regular beer, but I wouldn't anticipate seeing it, not this year. It's not on the production calendar for the year. We scaled back a great deal on a lot of the Belgian stuff we've made over the years, get a little more focused this year, but we still do make most of those beers. Okay, we have another beer. I've been handed another beer. Syncopathic. Which one? This one? Oh, yeah, that makes a lot more sense. Okay. So what we have here is actually, this was a beer that we started brewing last year as just kind of an experiment, and the response to it was really good, so we kept making it. It's called Syncopathic, and it is a dry hop sour ale. Essentially, again, this is part of the wild sour series that we make, so it's a kettle soured beer. It starts its life out very similar to what an American pale ale recipe would be before we sour it, and then after we do that, we move it back to the bright tank and we dry hop it to get the hop flavors that are in there. So this gives you a really nice play of sour and kind of like a citrusy, bitter, slightly tropical kind of fruit note on top of the beer. Yeah, this is one of my favorites. It seems to be going over particularly well here in the city. Seems to be our big mover here in town. Yes. Well, it's not yeast. It is bacteria. It's a bacterial culture. Yeah, Yeah, I mean, you're getting a little bit of a couple of things. You're getting some of those hops, which, forgive me, I believe there's Citra, Simcoe, and I want to say Chinook, but I could be wrong about that, that are dry hopped in here. So yeah, you're getting like some of those. The hops are specifically chosen for their. Oh, I know what it is. It's Mosaic. So you're getting like some of these tropical notes from the hops. You're also getting a little bit of that sour flavor from the souring process, and so I think that's what's contributing to some of those flavors here. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm a big fan, super refreshing. Who hates sour beer? Yeah, all right. Well, there's always some. I mean, I do apologize. We don't only make sour beers, but it does seem to be what is really popular for us outside of our home market. In Champaign and through most of downstate Illinois, the clean beers we make, like Abbey, our Weisenheimer, Hefeweizen, and our Vertex IPA all do really well, but it seems like, you get here, there's plenty of those beers around, and this is what kind of makes us stand out a little bit more from the crowd. So, yeah, sorry if you hate sour beers. We love them. I drink a ton of them, so you gotta keep plenty of Tums around. Such is life. Any thoughts, questions?
Do you know is the bacterial strain that you found a strain of lactobacillus?
Yeah, we don't have a lab, so it's a little sticky for us to like really get down to the nitty gritty and like identify it on like a either it's like genetic level or even just to kind of it just occurred in one of the barrels when we were spontaneously fermenting beers, and the brewers really liked it. They liked the way it was, the effect it was having on the beer. So basically, they just kept it going. They just kept that alive. I'm sure it could be isolated and identified, in an individual way, but we haven't taken the time to do that at this point. Yeah. Well, there's a couple answers to that question. One, currently, what we're brewing the question was whether or not we have tried to stop any of the events of the construction from potentially contaminating these beers. And to that, I have to say that the construction is actually taking place a couple miles down the road from us, so it's in no way affecting what's going on in the barrel room right now. However, the broader answer to that question is no. We don't try to stop anything from happening in there, more or less. Basically, we fill these barrels up. Most of them are like wine barrels, and they have a hole called the bung hole. Everyone get your laughs in now. We basically leave the bung hole open. We don't cap it off. We just let it sit there. And what will happen eventually is like a kind of a mold will grow across the top of that liquid. It's called a pellicle. It's really similar if anyone's ever brewed kombucha. It's not the same thing, but that's the closest thing I could say. Like it forms this layer across the top of waste, byproduct from the process of the bacteria doing its thing. And what where was I trying to go with that? So that stuff will basically prevent anything. It forms like a seal, essentially, over the liquid. So that pellicle will essentially keep the beer from getting affected any further. But we do have some concerns. I mean, not major ones, but we have some issues. Like, essentially, right now, there's a few reasons why we're draining as much of those barrels as possible. One is most of the beer is maturing. Most of it's about 3 years old, so it's getting to where we really want it to be. That what's not, or what we deem unusable, and every now and again you get hit with a barrel that's just like, whoa, that one got real weird, and that's undrinkable. So it gets dumped. Most of that stuff gets blended together to make a St. Dekkerra release. We're trying to get as much as we can out and bottled this year before we move, because we really don't know what moving those barrels from one location to the next is going to do to the liquid inside. And then there again, when we move into the new facility and we have all the barrels in their own area, we'll see. There's a little bit of a unknown factor in what those beers will turn into when they're aging in the new facility. I mean, again, it's only a few miles down the road, but they'll be subject to different types of yeast and bacteria. Yes?
So you're saying barrel, are you meaning a fooder?
Good question. We have both. Yeah, we have 3 fooders. Fooders are really big wood barrels. And at the new brewery, we will have a fooder room. Yes, sir.
So the French word for small wooden barrel is just a food.
Is that right? Well, ours are pretty big compared to our other barrels. We had one that was a cognac barrel. It had French cognac aged in it, and we received it and filled it with an imperial stout that was bottled and called 1920. That was done about 2 years ago, and there basically is almost none of it left in the market. If you happen to find it, pick yourself up some, because it's pretty tasty. All the people at the brewery try to find sales reps in out-of-state markets where there's still some left, and they're like, I'll give you all the money I have, buy it, and ship it to me, because everyone at the brewery is obsessed with 1920, and it's probably never going to be made again, so there you go. Okay, what you have in your hands right now is a beer called Plum Sour Stout. This is, as the name implies, it is a soured stout that has plum juice added to it. So this was first released last year in our quarter 4, so the last 3 months of the year this was released, and it will be seeing some time again at the end of this year. But anyway, sour stouts are kind of an anomaly. This is more of an American thing. It's not generally done that much outside of the United States, but with everybody in this country not giving a damn and sour and whatever they feel like, you have sour stouts now. How about it? So they're generally not my personal favorite kind of beer, but I was really pleased when I first had this one because it was not what I was anticipating. I felt like every time they would say, oh yeah, we're going to come up with this plum sour stout, like I think of plums and I think of prunes. And I was like, oh, sour raisin beer? I don't know how you guys are going to pull that off. But anyway, when I had it, first time I was like, oh yeah, plums. Yeah, those aren't prunes, and they're a little different. So a little more sweetness up front, followed with a sour kind of in the middle, and then finishes with that kind of roasty, kind of coffee end. But I like this beer. I drank a fair amount of it over the holiday season. It's pretty reasonable in alcohol, 5.5, I think.
5.6.
Thank you. So, yeah, sessionable as well. Another thing I've run into over the years with a lot of soured stouts is they're usually pretty strong, and it's just kind of a bit much. This one, I feel like we can sit down and drink a couple of these, but maybe you would disagree. Anyone disagree? Anyone hate this beer? It's okay if you don't like it. Okay.
Is there anybody that doesn't like sours but like they like this? Yeah?
All right.
People? It's not really that sour.
It's not as it's not super sour like some of our kettle soured beers, and we started off doing them a lot more sour and kind of found over time that people are a little more receptive to it when it's present but not overwhelming. It's not so one-dimensional. So this was kind of the first. Well, this is a beer in that series of the wild sour beers that we've made in the past where we really kind of, I think, strive for a little more balance. I like that beer. It's good. What's that? Yeah. I get that. I never would have thought that like chocolate and sour would find themselves like, hanging out, and me not hating it. But really, Yeah, there's a St. Dekkerra series beers are all spontaneously fermented. So back to the conversation about the bung and the bunghole and filling up empty wine barrels with beer and letting nature take its course. That's how this beer got its life. Actually, we back to the conversation about our fooders. This beer and the next beer we have to try were both aged in our French wine fooders. So they're pretty big. They're almost as tall as I am, and they're, shoot, I don't know, maybe 10 foot long. And the other day I actually had a chance to stick my head in one because it had been emptied, and they were cleaning it out with a power washer. And I was like, oh, this is going to be so cool. I've never seen inside one of these things. And I looked in, and it's just a bunch of wood. It's kind of like your grandma's basement, like wood paneling or something. Like, oh. That was underwhelming and not as cool as I thought it might be. But then again, I had to ask myself after the fact, like, what did I expect? So this is a Belgian blonde ale. It's called Voulez Blonde, which translates to dirty blonde. And the dirtiness comes from the fact that it's basically just soured. So, I mean, it's just a little inside joke sort of a thing. But really different than our wild sour beers that you tried. I mean, first off, the first thing you notice, like right away when I smell this beer, is like these real funky barnyardy flavors, or like aromas. And what you're picking up on there is Brettanomyces, which is a fancy name for wild yeast. It's a general name that kind of falls for all wild yeast beers, or all wild yeast strains. So that is the natural yeast that's occurring in the air all around us all the time that I mentioned before, that just finds its way into those casks and sours the beer. You don't taste it, you don't smell it in any of the wild sour beers because it's not present. That's a cultured bacteria. We keep it alive. It just doesn't produce the same flavors. So again, you get a lot of that kind of funky barnyardy, smell to the nose. Smells more like if you've ever had Belgian lambics or certain Belgian sours. It's kind of along those lines, and it's because those beers are spontaneously fermented. Yeah, so if we had a guy brewing beer like a quarter mile down the road, and doing it in this way, his beer would probably taste different than ours, just because the factors that come into the whatever's in the air, in the brewery, in the time that finds its way in. One thing we were kind of talking about, moving those barrels around, and we're trying to empty as many of them as we can before we have to move on to the next, to the new brewery in the barrel room. Right now, we grist all our mill, which basically is a fancy way of saying we grind it, in the same room that all these barrels are sitting in. So the grist mill will be in a new location at the new brewery. We don't really know if that will have any effects on how these beers start turning out. So all of those little factors are stuff that you sort of have to almost take into account, but at the same time, you kind of really are at their mercy. You don't really have any control over that stuff. All you can really do is kind of let the beer do what it's going to do on its own, periodically checking in on it and seeing, do we like the way this is tasting? Is it tasting the way we want it to? Is it tasting bad? If it's tasting bad, it usually gets dumped. If it's tasting pretty good, but this one tastes really good, those two might get blended. There's any number of options that we have, and it's kind of at the brewer's discretions what we decide to do with those beers. So I was up there a couple weeks ago, and we were basically bumming around the brewery pulling nails. Once the beer is in the cask and you want to taste it, take a drill, drill a tiny hole in the side of the head of a barrel, and you just catch the stream in a glass, and then you just start tasting. And you put a little nail in there so it can't, like as a stopper, and then next time you want to come by, you just pull the nail out, catch a little beer in a glass, go sit down, taste it again, decide, do I like this? Is it going the way I want it to? So yeah, that's kind of the whole thing. Dekkerra, another interesting tidbit of information about the name Dekkerra. I was raised Catholic. Perhaps many of you were as well, living in this beautiful area. But if not, there's lots of saints, and I don't know all their names. And I was like, is Saint Dekkerra like a real saint that like I've never heard of? You know, like from like who knows, like the 13th century or something. Maybe she had all her toes removed, and they're in some chapel somewhere in like Milan or something. And that's not the case. They do have like for us like heads and stuff like that. I've seen some of them. It's pretty crazy. But anyway, Saint Dekkerra. Dekkerra in Europe is the term typically used for what we call in America Brettanomyces, which is the wild yeast. So Matt named the whole series of beers Saint Dekkerra in reference to that wild yeast strain. So, and kind of to pay homage to the wild yeasts that exist in our world. So, last beer of the evening. This is called Zure. It is a imperial stout or double stout. We call it a Belgian double stout, which you could debate doesn't really exist, but we call it that basically because we brew it with a Belgian yeast strain. We use the same Trappist yeast that we use for all of our Belgian beers, like our quad and our triple. Abbey single uses that yeast strain. So we brew a double batch of stout with this yeast strain, and then this particular beer was aged in the same foeder that the 1920 was aged in. So the imperial stout that was aged in the cognac barrels, once that was done, we cleaned it all out, filled it back up with this beer. So a similar base beer, but a lot of the cognac flavor has been stripped out of that barrel by virtue of having the beer sitting in it for 3 years. So you don't really get any of those notes added. It's mostly just the oak and yeast. So again, another sour stout, but a much different version than the plum. No fruit added. Again, a pretty Brett forward nose, like kind of sharp and slightly, you can almost smell the acidity before you even taste it. So, big, rich, full-bodied, but persistent acidity, like from like almost the start, but not quite, and it just kind of goes all the way through to the end. Kind of leaves you with that. I don't even know what to call that flavor, but it's sharp. Rocket fuel? Okay. I'll take that. That's good. Yeah. You need a job? We need somebody to come up with beer label descriptions. You know, I don't know off the top of my head, but you're in at 9.9, according to the label. 9.9%. That is what the label says. Yeah. 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 And over time, that you know, some of those rougher edges. This is actually like super fresh. I mean, it's the kind of beer that could easily be cellared, could be laid down for some time. It's going to continue to develop in the bottle. So yeah, there's definitely potential to just hang on to a beer like this for quite some time and just kind of see how it evolves. My guess is that some of that real sharp acidity is going to taper off and kind of mellow over time. It's going to get a little smoother. All its little sharp edges are going to kind of round it off. So, question, which will be open this spring. We don't have a firm date on it yet because a lot of what those factors are contingent a lot on the weather right now, just on what can be done construction-wise. So that is the number one biggest priority. We'd love to have you guys all up. Like I say, I think we're shooting for April, but again, we don't have a firm date on that as of right now. That brewery will have its own tasting room, and that includes, I mean, a beer as well as a restaurant. It won't be quite, it'll be a little more casual than our pubs, which are pretty fine dining, but it will, but still, it'll have food and we'll have plenty of great beers. That is the big thing. Outside of that, I mentioned the blueberry goza that we're going to do this year, the apricot syncopathic that we're going to do this year, a lot more Saint Dekkerras, and I kind of talked a little bit about that, but because a lot of those beers are finally reaching maturation, and because we want to bottle anything that we can before we move, we're going to release as many of those as we can this year. So keep your eyes peeled. They're generally very rare and pretty sporadic in their release, but I think we're going to see quite a few this year. So keep your eyes peeled for those. Those beers are essentially, what's the word I want to say? They're one of a kind. They're really, really hard to reproduce, and we don't really attempt to reproduce them in exactly the same way that they were before. We can make the same beer and age it in a barrel. We can't expect the same results, and we're not necessarily shooting for that. We're basically kind of letting, it's a way for us to kind of let nature run its course and kind of show you guys what that is like. So that's kind of the nature of the whole program.